all of those things go through that engineering design process, and that's about product improvement to solve real-world problems. And I think Christians can get really especially excited about this idea because we're working with people to solve real-world problems, to love our neighbor, to exercise good and wise dominion over God's world.
Welcome to the BJU Press Teacher Edition podcast, where Christian educators are encouraged and inspired as we bring you interviews, practical ideas, strategies, and answer your questions about teaching in today's culture. And here's your host, Jenny Copeland.
It's time for another episode here on the Teacher Edition podcast. I'm excited to be back with you. I appreciate you taking time to join in. As a reminder, you can find us on social media. We're Teacher Edition Podcast on Facebook and on YouTube as well. You can also find us on Instagram and TikTok at Teacher Edition Pod. Our website also has great information about our episodes and our guests. There's also a place where you can sign up for our newsletter and submit questions. So I am so excited today to have Rachel Santopietro back with us today. Perhaps you caught her first episode on the podcast. Wow, that was a little over a year ago. Rachel is passionate about helping students experience joy in their learning. She has degrees in chemistry, master's in education. She even now has her doctorate in learning design and technology. She's been a teacher as well as a writer, and she draws from both of those as she serves in her current position, which is overseeing instructional design for the different writing teams here at BJU Press. Her husband and she have 3 children, and they enjoy lots of outdoor adventures, including rock climbing, which always just amuses me. That's pretty amazing. Rachel, thanks for being back with us again here on the Teacher Edition podcast.
Yeah, happy to be here. We're getting to talk about science. Very exciting.
Oh, yes. So, Rachel, you do have a love for science, but I know you also love math and technology, and I think we can all see where that's going. That's headed for STEM. So this is where I'd like to park today and hopefully pick your brain and your experience to unpack this topic a little more. So STEM is a really broad term. It's a broad topic. It really touches schools in varying ways, in different applications, I guess we could say. So we hear that term thrown around. Rachel, how would you define STEM? Let's start with that. What is it?
Yeah, so, obviously, STEM is an acronym, and it stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The component that people are most uncomfortable with is that E, that engineering component.
Absolutely.
But we've also seen a variety of other letters being added to the acronym STEM. So you've got STEAM, where you have art being added, and you have STREAM, where you're adding related arts. And it's kind of a joke. I think eventually we're going to end up in an acronym with all the letters from the subjects
the whole
in
alphabet,
it. It's kind of funny. But STEM isn't really about the individual subjects. So at school, you have especially on the secondary level, you have your English classroom, and you have your Spanish classroom, and you have your science classroom, and you have your math classroom. And the subjects are kind of kept separate. But in real life, the subjects are just kind of all mushed together in this big messy thing called, life. And STEM is more like life, where the subjects are coming together. So there's connections between those disciplines. And I would really think about STEM as solving real-world problems in a collaborative environment. Now, there are really not any standards on what STEM actually is. That hasn't really been regulated. But I think that there are 3 kind of essential components for a learning experience to be called a STEM experience. The first component is that it needs to happen in a collaborative environment. And that's really important in the 21st century skills, is students developing the ability to work with each other, to come together to solve a problem that they couldn't really solve by themselves. They're pooling knowledge, they're finding the best solutions. That's what collaboration is all about. So collaboration is the first key component of STEM. The second key component of STEM is the idea of you're solving a real world problem. So STEM is actually a subcategory of what we call problem-based learning. And the idea of this authentic real world problem is really fundamental to STEM. to the STEM learning experience. And then the third component is the engineering design process. And the engineering design process is really kind of like what the scientific method is to a science experiment. So that's really what STEM is.
Okay. So keeping along that same thought, I think you kind of just told us what the essential elements are of STEM. That was the next thing I was going to ask you about. So we're talking about collaboration, being authentic. So let's park on that third element that you just mentioned. We've heard that term, engineering design process. Maybe we can stop there for just a minute. Can you talk more about what is that and how does that really fit in here to STEM?
Sure. So it's kind of like the scientific method again, where there's this stepwise process, but it's also iterative. So the idea is you might not just go through all the different steps one time. You might go through steps 1 to 4, then go back and do steps 3 and 4, and then go back on, jump forward to 5. So there's this general progression through the steps, but you might cycle through the steps a couple times. So the steps of the engineering design process are you start with that question, that problem that you're trying to solve. All right. So what is the real world problem that you're focusing on? And then maybe you brainstorm, and that's where the collaboration really comes in. So different people might have different ideas for how to solve that problem, and you might not just pick one of those ideas. You might pick a couple of those ideas working together. Then you start to develop a plan where you would build something. And I think that's actually one of the essential components of the engineering design process is that you're designing something, you're building something. And then you would test it. So now this is the part that usually gets pretty iterative, because sometimes when you do something in your head and then you actually go test it, it doesn't turn out the way that you were expecting it
Right.
to. So then you have to go back to the drawing board, so to speak, and try another plan.
Right.
And then you test it again. And once you end up with a really good solution, the last step of the engineering design process is that you share that idea with other people. And the idea there is you're contributing to the community. And so that's really exciting, I think, because that's how you can see progress with solutions, engineering design solutions. And when you think about, your phone or your computer, or even a light or a desk chair, all of those things go through that engineering design process, and that's about product improvement to solve real-world problems. And I think Christians can get really especially excited about this idea because we're working with people to solve real-world problems, to love our neighbor, to exercise good and wise dominion over God's world.
Yeah, excellent. That's a great process. I love how clearly you laid that out. Okay, so with that foundation, let's bring this closer and let's hone in on the classroom. I mean, this all has to do with the classroom, but let's come even closer. So Rachel, in your experience, how do you think teachers can give students STEM experiences? Like some are very little schools, some don't have a lot of resources. What are some examples of those experiences that teachers could give students in their classroom?
So it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be expensive. There are a lot of there's some classic STEM activities that you could do. I think one of them is the egg drop experiment, where you're taking an egg. And of course, if you were to go from a high place and drop an egg, what would happen? It would break. But the egg drop experiment is one where you would design a way so that when you drop the egg, it doesn't break. And you'd say, well, what are the real world connections there? What about shipping? When you mail something, I remember one teacher told me that one of the STEM activities that she did was every student had to mail themselves a potato chip, and it had to survive. And I thought, what a great example. Because
not a chance. Not a chance. Have they not checked out how shipping goes these days?
Yeah, but you have to design packaging that would allow the potato chip to
That's
survive.
awesome.
And of course, if you're buying something that's made of glass, or something that's fragile, that kind of packaging is going to be crucial for you to end up with something that you can actually use versus something that you can't use. So I love the potato chip example because it's super easy. And the egg drop experiment is very similar. But if you wanted to translate that to an even more fun real world context, I've seen a physics teacher who took that idea of the egg drop experiment and thought of it like a rover that you're landing, a rover on Mars. It's the same idea. You've got this delicate equipment. How can you land it safely on the surface of Mars? So that's kind of a classic example, but there's other things that you could do too, like earthquake-resistant engineering. If you're building things with popsicle sticks or blocks, and the teacher can have a shake table. And of course, there's definitely a real-world connection there. Legos are fantastic for STEM activities as well. A little bit more on the more involved side, there are robotics communities and competitions that schools can participate in. My youngest son is involved in robotics and absolutely loves it. And BJU Press is working to implement STEM activities into all of our science and math textbooks. So every book, every math and science, starting in kindergarten and going up to 12th grade, will have at least 2 ideas for STEM activities because we really want to support STEM education.
So our audience is varied. We have different subject experts. We also have varying grade levels represented. Rachel, how do you feel STEM experiences in, let's just say, elementary, middle, and high school? How do they compare? I mean, they're all approaching them differently. They're different types of experiences. How would you compare those?
So I would think about the 3 different grade bands. So maybe you've got preschool to early elementary, and then you've got later elementary to middle school, and then you've got high school. So I'll talk about each of those different phases. So in preschool and early elementary school, the main idea is exposure. So students are building those math and science and engineering skills. And I think a really great way to do this is directed play, especially at learning centers. And I've seen preschools that have implemented STEM. And one of the big things is the kids need to be getting their hands on those scientific tools.
Yes.
So the teachers are not demonstrating it, the kids are using it. And what can really help would be a teacher asking questions along the way, to kind of in a Socratic seminar kind of way, to really help promote that thinking. And as they're asking questions, they can also be introducing that science, math, and engineering vocabulary. And that's really exposing these kids to these ideas and helping them develop some hands-on skills as well. So they can be playing with water, with sand, with blocks. Again, I mentioned Legos. One of the things that my youngest son did when he was in elementary school was remote control cars. And that was really interesting because, of course, and these weren't just like little remote control cars. These were remote control cars that could go like 40 miles per hour. And he would take these to like bike courses, and he would send them flying off these ramps and turning flips. And then, of course, what happens when they land? Well, they break. Well, then you have to take them apart and figure out what's broken and order the new parts and put it back together. So there's the driving and seeing what's happening, but there's also the fixing. And that's part of that STEM experience as well. So elementary school, the main idea is exposure. With later elementary school and middle school, the idea is exploration. So this is where, again, some of those the egg drop experiment, maybe even some stop motion animation, earthquake resistant engineering, those are all ideas that students could pull in and just start to play with these ideas. But they have a little bit more of that science and math, engineering background. They have more of that vocabulary, and they're also learning to work better with other students as well. And so again, they're still building those skills, but they can do a little bit more than they could before. When it comes to high school, the main idea is engagement. So these design competitions, I'll mention that at each level, museums are a great idea because a lot of them have these hands-on activities where the students can, it's just set up. It's almost like learning centers already set up at the museums. And sometimes it's a lot of fun for students. Even escape rooms can be a fun kind of developing that STEM thinking as well. A lot of after-school clubs will help with that, especially on the high school level. The robotics, you've got tightrope challenges, that kind of thing. I also heard of a school in inner city Philadelphia that had an after-school automotive club. So it was a math teacher that started an after-school STEM club, and they were building a hybrid vehicle to participate in the X Prize solar powered, and they were competing against Fortune 500 companies.
Wow.
And they ended up in the semifinals. So it's really amazing what kids can do. I've heard of other students in high schools, even, high schools that aren't like, elite either, participating in design competitions where they have to create a robot that would navigate an underwater maze. And they could be competing against colleges and still do very, very well because of the collaboration and the support that they have from the teacher.
That's great. I love how you broke it down. Sometimes I think it can be overwhelming thinking, at elementary, we have to cover everything. Like they have to be professionals, before they leave elementary school. But I love that you broke it down to say, in elementary, exposing them is great for that level. Then exploration, then engagement. And I think it's great if we keep that long-term in mind and also know, even if you're at high school, this isn't just the basics of exploration. They do need to step it up a notch. That engagement is so important. They're getting ready to go into the next phase of their learning, to working. And I love how you broke it down: exposure, exploration, and engagement. So we talked about what STEM is. We talked about what STEM experiences look like. But why is all of this important? Just because something is hammered over and over in education does not automatically give it viability. We all know that. So Rachel, generally, what would you say, why is STEM education important?
Well, I believe it's the National Science Foundation that estimates that 80% of the jobs in the next decade will be related to STEM fields.
It's amazing.
So not that literature isn't important and history isn't important, but you're going to have those STEM skills maybe along with those other skills as well. These are complementary skills. It's kind of like reading, writing, and arithmetic. You kind of use them everywhere. And I think some of those STEM skills are starting to be that way as well. So it's important to prepare students for the jobs of the future. And it's interesting to me how sometimes school doesn't keep up with industry and businesses find that they need to train students in new ways because schools aren't moving fast enough to keep up with the developments in business. So part of what we're doing here is we're preparing students for jobs that might not even exist yet. I mean, if you go into McDonald's, it's a lot different than it was 10 years ago. You've got this big screen, you just order, you take your number and you just wait. If you use the app, you get, deals. It wasn't that way when I was a kid and you went to McDonald's, you walked up to the counter and you order your burger and you wait, it's a different experience. And we even have, we have driverless combines and we have stores that don't have any employees working in them. So we need to prepare students for the jobs of the future. And that really helps them better live and serve God as well.
Yeah. So another term we hear much about these days is 21st century skills. That seems to kind of seep in everywhere. How does that play in here with STEM? How would you say that STEM is related to 21st century skills? Is there a connection?
So if you look at the lists of what people say are the 21st century skills, they vary.
True.
But most of them start with C.
Right.
So
yes.
Creativity, collaboration, critical thinking, problem solving, those are the ones that come up a lot. And if you think about just those four, and there could be others that you could add to the mix. If you think about just those four STEM STEM activities, STEM learning experiences address all 4 of those. So that is one of the reasons why STEM learning experiences are so valuable, is again, because it is related to preparing students for those jobs of the future. And again, we do still need to have that communication because the collaboration's part of it, and the writing skills as well. But again, it's in this technical environment that students need to be able to navigate.
Yeah. And they love making those connections. Like, it's great when they start and they all of a sudden realize, oh, wow, I saw one of these on the way to school, or my dad uses one of these as, or, and they start making those connections. So I love that. Let's talk now about the impact of STEM. So classrooms have limited time and resources, and they're really looking for experiences with the biggest ROI. Rachel, what do you see as the impact of STEM experiences on students? We've kind of touched on this a little bit, but how would you sum that up?
So I think of my youngest son, especially the one who's in robotics. That's one of the most recent experiences that I've had. So he started in robotics when he was in 6th grade, and he wasn't quite sure that he wanted to stick with it. The tournaments were a little stressful for him. And then he had a tournament where things just went really, really well, and he started getting very interested in it. And when I walk into the robotics lab, I see a whiteboard and kids are writing mathematical equations on the board. What's really great is they're not in math class. They're transferring their skills that they're learning in the classroom to life. And that is a fantastic benefit of STEM. And I've seen my son do that as well. He's developed this vocabulary when it comes to engineering and building that's been really great to see. And he's talking about it at home during his spare time. He's excited about this content. And I think that, to go back to one of the other podcasts that I did, it's really tapping into that growth mindset as well. So students are the most invested in their learning when they're creating, and they get very excited about these STEM experiences. So the competition is great as well. And I'm thinking back to the robotics example, but there's also this level of community. So 6th grade, my son was kind of getting into that. I started seeing this persistence in problem solving emerge. So the students that were involved in robotics were a lot more persistent in their problem solving than the students that weren't. That's the engineering design process, right? You plan, you test, it doesn't work. You plan, you test, it doesn't work. So you keep trying new things. And the students that were in robotics would do this 10 to 15 times, whereas a student who's not, maybe they do it 2. They're going to give up a lot faster. So that persistence is a really valuable trait for students to develop in their learning and in their work. And another really neat thing that I saw develop, especially from my son's robotics experiences, was this sense of community. So his 3rd year of robotics, his team developed a YouTube channel where they would do release videos, and they would talk about their building and their challenges and that kind of thing. And when they would go to tournaments, they would set up their pit and they would have a sign with a QR code saying, hey, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and they would get other kids from public schools. They're one of the few Christian schools that are doing this robotics competition. These got robotics competitions. And so they would get kids from public schools that would subscribe to their YouTube channel, and they would start meeting them at other tournaments, or they'd see them at nationals. They also went to Worlds last year. So it's just really offering good opportunities to connect with community, to share knowledge, but also to be a Christian influence in that kind of community as well. And they have a reputation for being a Christian school, which is really neat in the way that they interact with people.
Absolutely.
And, and their work that they do.
Yeah, that's amazing. They do learn to work. They learn to problem solve. I love that. And they also they learn to work together. And that's something I even saw when I was working in that area too. The first few weeks, they couldn't get along. They didn't like anyone else's ideas. They couldn't problem solve. And then just seeing those as you mentioned in your other podcast, those muscles start being worked and get stronger and stronger. So like you said, they are great problem solvers. They do learn to listen to others, and those are great, great skills. So as we wrap up this episode, I want to make sure that we tie in biblical worldview shaping. So biblical worldview is definitely the heart of this podcast. Is there a connection to STEM specifically, though? Maybe we could phrase it this way. How can we use STEM experiences for community connection, which you kind of already talked about a little bit, but also for biblical worldview shaping? What do you think?
When you go back to the beginning of Genesis, the first command given to man was to wisely use God's world. And that requires science, engineering, math. It requires communication. It requires all those things. So you could say that there's a component of STEM that's creational. God created us to exercise good and wise dominion over his world. Now, of course, the world that we live in is fallen. And that's why STEM is often about solving problems, because we don't live in an ideal world. And as we look for solutions to those problems, we are participating in that redemptive process, especially when we're doing it with a heart of love and concern. We want to help people who bear God's image. So we can really see, a biblical worldview, again, that lens of creation, fall, and redemption, lending immense value to the STEM learning experience. And I'll give quick example. I heard of a school that was a math teacher was teaching a lesson on unit on statistics, and they lived in New Jersey, and they had been just doing kind of a brainless survey of what students' favorite candy bars were. Well, they connected with someone who had some community connections to some community problems, and one of the problems was that they were located in a food desert. So this school decided to pivot their statistics project and start doing surveys in their area about the availability of food, and even just assessing people's knowledge of what is healthy and how to cook with healthy foods. And they presented their results to this community committee. And then they started working with local restaurants and developing food gardens to really try to solve this community problem of the food desert. And what was really neat about it was students got very passionate about this, and they started developing statistical tools that were beyond their grade level because they were so interested in solving this real world problem. So again, this idea of creation, fall, redemption, we're exercising good and wise dominion, we're loving our neighbor, and we're trying to solve those real world problems to help people who bear God's image. So I think it's a great example of how it links with a biblical worldview.
Absolutely, for sure. So STEM is so important for our classrooms. It gives students those deeper, more authentic experiences. It also gives them an opportunity to further develop their talents. We've talked about that. Explore interests as they seek what God has for their lives. Rachel, you brought great information today. Lots of great ideas and thoughts all to the table. So it's been really great having you on the show again. Thanks for being here.
It's been a pleasure.
And listeners, thank you for joining us today. I hope you were challenged and encouraged as I was. Remember to go to teachereditionpodcast.com to submit questions for upcoming episodes. Of course, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on social media. Now, it's time to get back to your day. But it's not just any day, because every day in the classroom is your day to impact and inspire through God's power and through His grace working in you. Go do what God has called you to do.